Recently, a group of more than 2,000 Swiss women won a historic lawsuit against their country, which put Switzerland on the hook for its climate change impacts. I say historic because this is the first time that a climate change related suit has been taken up by the European Court of Human Rights. And even more recently, a group of island nations earned a favorable opinion for the Oceans Court that will help them hold polluting countries accountable. What did these cases argue, and what do these victories mean for cases to come? Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about the climate crisis and clean energy transition. If those are important topics to you, hit that subscribe button below and ring the bell so you don't miss every time I post. Now let's get into today's climate news, starting with the Swiss case. So, the group of women we're talking about today is called the Association of Senior Women for Climate Protection Switzerland. Here's the Swiss name on the screen because I will not pronounce that well. All the women named in the lawsuit are over the age of 55, with an average age of being 74. This is because people over the age of 55, especially women, are more likely to be impacted by heat-related stressors and illnesses made worse by the climate crisis. The plaintiffs used this fact to argue that Switzerland violated their right to life and other legally binding guarantees listed under the European Convention of Human Rights by not sufficiently working to tackle the climate crisis. Every European country has signed on to follow these rights except for the Vatican City, Belarus, and Russia, of course. Let's take a look at the merits of their case. Firstly, it's very clear from the trends we're seeing every summer that Europe is getting hit by more extreme and long heat waves, which are causing mass snowmelt, drought, and wildfires. In fact, Europe is warming up twice as fast as the rest of the world, not to be outdone by the poles, according to the Copernicus Climate Change Service. This is a concerning trend that has resulted in 30% more heat deaths on the continent compared with 20 years ago. In Switzerland, known as the Water Tower of Europe, one of the biggest concerns is how much snowmelt has declined yearly. In just the last 2 years, Swiss glaciers have lost 10% of their volume, which is disastrous because that's how much volume the glaciers lost between 1960 and 1990. The melting point, which is the point at which precipitation turns into rain versus snow, is rising, causing a lot of the precipitation to just stay as rain. This causes flooding and landslides locally and drought for much of Europe that relies on the snow melt in the summer to replenish their groundwater. So that's just a bit about how climate change is already impacting Swiss people. So what has Switzerland done to reduce its greenhouse gases to slow down this disaster? Actually, it's been one of the more successful European countries when it comes to dropping emissions. These reductions have been primarily from the building and transportation sector, thanks to the high adoption rates of electric vehicles and heat pumps. That being said, according to 2022 numbers provided by the International Energy Agency, almost half of Switzerland's energy still comes from fossil fuels, with an additional 12.6% coming from biofuels and burning waste, which I personally don't really count as clean energy most of the time. So Switzerland's main sources of clean energy are nuclear and hydropower, which account for more than 28% and 11.5% of the country's energy mix, respectively. The Swiss women also argue that their fellow residents are consuming beyond what's considered sustainable for the planet to sustain future generations, something that the government hasn't really tried to tackle through policy, despite its own statistics office reporting on that issue. Due to the country's continued use of fossil fuels and lack of necessary policies, the Climate Action Tracker ranked Switzerland as insufficient when it came to their role to keep emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius, like the Paris Agreement requires. In the end, the European Court of Human Rights sided with the women, concluding that Switzerland has failed to properly tackle its climate impact, resulting in increased death of its citizens from extreme heat. Specifically, Switzerland failed its promise to cut emissions by 20% by 2020 compared with 1990 levels, violating Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. The court narrowed in on the right to respect private and family life, not the right to life, interestingly, but whatever works. The court found that Article 8 of the convention, quote, encompasses a right for individuals to effective protection by the state authorities from the serious adverse effects of climate change on their lives, health, well-being, and quality of life. This is a very important statement because back in 2003, the court said the convention did not encompass the right of the country's environment, just its people. But by the women making this case on the impact of climate change on the people directly relating to heat deaths, the court was able to make this caveat that climate change should be considered a risk to human health and well-being. Now for the question I'm sure is on all of your minds right now. Does this ruling hold any weight? What teeth does the European court have? Well, the court didn't provide any specific action for Switzerland to do to remedy the situation per se. Mostly this case sets a legal precedent so that if Switzerland fails to hit its next target, which is to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, it'll have a bolstered lawsuit heading its way. More broadly, this case provides a new legal precedent for any cases involving climate change and the European countries that signed the convention. It is frustrating that there's not an immediate punishment or change the Swiss government has to contend with from the case, but we'll have to keep an eye on future cases to see if this win leans the legal climate in favor of climate action. There's already 6 more climate-related lawsuits currently waiting to be heard in front of the Human Rights Court that were paused pending this decision. These include a lawsuit against the Norwegian government that alleges it violated human rights by issuing new licenses for oil and gas exploration in the Barents Sea beyond 2035. Now, it's also important to note that the Swiss case was one of 3 climate suits brought in front of the court and was the only one to win. The other 2 were a case against 32 European governments by 6 Portuguese young people impacted by sea level rise, and a French mayor suing the French federal government for not enacting tougher climate change laws. As you can see, people and organizations are using all kinds of methods to argue for legally backed action on climate change. This Swiss case is one of many I've seen this year, and maybe I'll go into some other cases I've seen more recently in another video. But another international court that just ruled in favor of climate action that we will talk about in this video is the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, also known as the Oceans Court. Several small island nations asked the 21 judges for advisory opinions on 2 key questions. Are greenhouse gases marine pollutants under the convention, and can countries be held accountable for that pollution? For context, the convention was signed in the 1970s by 165 countries when it ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Signers include China, Russia, and India, but not the US because the Senate wouldn't ratify it, as per usual. While the decision of the Germany-based court is non-binding, it would provide another precedent for international and national courts to weigh future climate change decisions on. So, are greenhouse gases marine pollutants? Well, marine pollutants are any material that poses a risk to an aquatic ecosystem. So let's briefly look at how greenhouse gases could fall into that category. The ocean, which covers 70% of the Earth's surface and is responsible for more than half of the oxygen we breathe, takes up the vast majority of the heat trapped by greenhouse gases. As a result, the ocean is warming at an alarming rate, sometimes reaching hot tub temperatures. And this is having major adverse impacts on marine ecosystems. So that's definitely risking aquatic ecosystems, to say the least. What I would say is an even more direct example of greenhouse gases being a marine pollutant, though, is ocean acidification. Not only are greenhouse gases causing climate change, but they are also changing the pH of our oceans by binding with other molecules in the water. This is causing many problems, including disrupting fish brain chemistry and making it difficult for plankton, which is the base of our food chain, to develop shells. It's kind of a big deal. Now, island nations are especially interested in creating precedents to sue for climate action and reparations because while they have contributed the least to climate change itself, they are adversely impacted by it. For one, they rely on these impacted ecosystems for food and economic development. Sea level rise is also making their land literally disappear and causing their fresh water to turn salty. And climate change is causing more extreme weather events like hurricanes, which sweep through the island nations. So the plaintiffs were elated to hear a unanimous yes from the judges for both of those two questions. Greenhouse gases count as marine pollutants, and countries can be held accountable for that pollution. Yay! In fact, the judges specifically said the larger polluting nations had a greater responsibility than smaller and vulnerable ones for emitting greenhouse gases, and as a result, the bigger polluters should provide financial support and technical assistance to the island nations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the cases that we talked about today. What do you think about the Swiss ruling? What do you think about the Oceans Court ruling? How would you sue your country to effectively speed up climate action if you could? Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comment section below. Just to put more cases like these on your radar, by the way, we do have 2 more international cases to look forward to. One will be heard by the International Court of Justice and focuses on whether nations are legally bound to protect against climate risks, and the other will be heard by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Brazil and focuses on states' obligations to address human rights concerns relating to the climate crisis. So this is an exciting time for any legal nerds in the climate space. It's time for a fun fact about Rue. This is kind of an indirect fun fact about Rue, but Rue has a new cousin. Her name is Lucy. She's a really cute little dog that my brother got from the shelter, and we are just so happy to have her as part of our little family. So welcome, Lucy. And that was sort of a fun fact about Rue. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news and environmental organizations. Thank you to the people on Patreon who help support me and my fur baby Rue. A special shout out to the climate confident and courageous David H., Paul B., Phil Plasma, Dan Morton, Specker, Breezy, Deanne, Kevin Morton, SKP Joe's Course Gold, and Gary Stark. I greatly appreciate your support of $5 or more. If you would like to support the work I do, please check out the Patreon and buy me a coffee, links in the description below for reoccurring or one-time payments. Bye for now.